Thanks for attending the Northern Forest Birds Network webinar series. I'm so excited to share with our webinar today because we're taking a little break from our focal species research science presentations to kind of go back into our forestry for the birds world. So I have a kind of like a little panel discussion today with our three lake states with Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. We have Michael Paling, who's been a Michigan forester for 6 years with American Bird Conservancy, and he is coordinating our Forestry for Michigan Birds program. And then Christian Nelson is the Lake States coordinator for the Forest Stewards Guild and has been coordinating for the Forestry for Minnesota Birds initiative and which has recently been published. So we're really excited to share that with you today. And then I'm going to spend a few minutes at the end talking about forestry for Wisconsin birds. So thanks so much for coming. I will also be sharing a link for CFEs for the Wildlife Society and SAF. So first we'll have Michael kind of start us off and we'll go from there.
Cool. Thanks, Jamie, for inviting us back to talk a little bit about the Forestry for Birds programs. I'm gonna, of course, focus heavily on Michigan because that's what I know, and Christian will cover everything for what's going on in Minnesota. But before I jump into everything Michigan related, I figure I would start with a little bit of info on the background of these Forestry for Birds programs, kind of for anybody that is not familiar with how they got started or why they got started. But the Michigan and subsequent Great Lakes states programs have been taking a lot of lessons from states out in the New England area. So this all started with Vermont Foresters for the Birds to promote silvicultural management for northern hardwoods, specifically for bird species, of course, over in Vermont. And it has slowly spread from one state to another. I'll share in the next slide is some of those states that I know have respective programs like these. But the whole purpose of these Forestry for Birds programs is to help landowners and natural resource managers manage forests in ways that are beneficial to birds and all wildlife overall. So I like to say that we are not necessarily trying to create anything new per se in terms of silvicultural management. We are trying to help connect the dots between silvicultural management and wildlife habitat. Uh, there's a lot of birds out there, and they all like to have a little bit of different habitat features that they use. So it's important to be able to try and connect the dots in the management that we do to the bird habitat. So we have lots of resources. These ones I have on the screen are from our partner or the other states that we all took lessons from. We've been doing trainings and workshops throughout Michigan for a couple years now, and we've had some pretty good feedback and reception throughout the state. So this slide here is a map of all the different states that I personally know about have some sort of forestry for the birds program in their respective states. So there might be some here that I'm missing. If there are and anybody knows about it, feel free to throw it into the chat because that would be helpful. But we've been working pretty closely across Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, a little bit into Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio for kind of a region-wide partnership that we're working across the different states. And of course, there's we've always got to touch on kind of why we want to be doing this, but when it comes to working with landowners, private landowners is a big part of my job. When it Wildlife is usually one of the biggest reasons they own their property or they want to manage their property. They really enjoy doing the right management, the right stewardship for their property to make their habitat as best as it can be for not just birds, but overall wildlife habitat for everything. And being able to sell forest management through the lens of bird habitat helps a little bit in being able to get our messages across of forest stewardship. And of course, birds need a lot of our help. Hopefully by now, most of us have heard since the 1970s, we've lost almost 3 billion birds. Uh, and that does include a lot of forest birds in our respective regions as well. So being able to think about bird habitat with our forest management can really help impact or provide the suitable breeding and post-breeding habitat that a lot of birds need in our states. And just to give a little perspective about our Great Lakes region, we have a pretty diverse uh, breeding species richness for our region, especially this northern forests region of the Great Lakes states. You can see here, um, I think I think you guys are seeing my mouse now. Up in the northern forest area, where it has over 60 different uh, 60 breeding bird species richness. So compared to the rest of the country, except for the northern New England states, we have a pretty high richness. In Michigan, we have over 221 uh, breeding species confirmed in Michigan. There's many more species that use it as stopover sites or during migratory season. And Michigan itself is over 50% forested. So uh, that's a lot of the state. And I guess I shouldn't say I know that Minnesota or Wisconsin are about the same, but they're pretty close to 50% forested. I think if I remember right, Wisconsin has 17 million acres, but I can't remember how many acres of forest land Minnesota has. Maybe Christian will know later. So, forest management across our region is quite important for birds, for our forest habitat. And that's why we have been working through these Forestry for Birds programs. So these are the cover pages for our Michigan programs. We have two different guides, one specifically for landowners, one specifically for managers. The landowners guide takes out a lot of the jargon, keeps it a little bit simpler for anybody that is not necessarily wanting to dive too deep into the nitty-gritty silviculture of the management, but just wants to start understanding a little bit about the simple things that they can do on on their property for their habitat. And then the manager's guide goes much more into depth, provides a lot more information about the different bird species and what they require for their habitat, species or habitat recommendations for managing for those species. And then it dives into uh, the different forest types that we have across our region, as well as the silvicultural practices that we use for managing those forests. So our effort in Michigan started back in 2018, where discussions from American Bird Conservancy and a couple other partners started to get this idea off the ground. And we had an initial stakeholder input meeting back in April of 2019, which included people from industrial forestry companies, loggers, consulting foresters, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, Michigan DNR, U.S. Forest Service, and several other entities that we were getting a lot of input across all different partners throughout Michigan. Definitely well received. And in 2020, we were successful in securing some funding from the Forest Service's landscape scale restoration program to really get everything that we were doing off the ground. And throughout the next couple of years, we had some good discussions about what we wanted these materials to look like and how we wanted it to be developed and put together. Um, in 2022, we finally finished those guides, and we have been distributing them ever since, doing outreach workshops, news articles, presentations, and several rounds of printing of getting these guides out into people's hands. So it's been, like I said before, very well received in our state, and I'm glad to see that it's continuing throughout the whole region as well, not just Michigan. And to give you a little bit of insight for anybody that is not familiar with what Michigan has or kind of the inner workings of our information and how it lays out and looks. We have information specifically about 20 different priority bird species that we've chosen. We chose those bird species for many different reasons, but we started off with the Northern Forest Bird Network's priority species list. And I believe Ryan Brady gave a presentation on those priority species a while ago, but I can't remember specifically when. But as you can see here with the brown thrasher and cerulean warbler as examples, we have information about what they look like, their identification, their songs, uh, what they eat, their territory, where you're going to see them throughout Michigan. And then we end off with information about habitat management recommendations and how you specifically can manage for that individual bird species. Um, One of the things with these management recommendations is that it was hard to pare down words. Putting all of this into one little paragraph is a challenge. So there are sometimes additional resources and additional links that we included in those management recommendations. As you can see in the cerulean warbler, for an example, we have a link to the best management practices for the cerulean warbler. So there are additional resources that we point you towards to kind of fill out a lot more information than we can fit into just a small paragraph. But it gets you started in thinking about the habitat management for that bird. And this image here is all of our different priority bird species. We have it laid out in kind of a graph format to depict where you're likely to see the bird species in the understory versus midstory or the overstory of the forest, as well as whether you're going to see that most likely in conifer forests versus hardwood forests. For example, you got the Kirtland's warbler way on the left side. It's a hopefully we all know it's pretty uh, dependent on jack pine forests, so very heavy to conifers. And then the golden winged warbler on the right side is very dependent on deciduous forests. And we also depicted some information about the different forest types in Michigan. And this part was probably the most debated part of the whole guide. We went back and forth about how we want to break the forest types up across the state or how we want to put them into kind of nice little boxes, which forest types don't really fit easily into nice little boxes sometimes. So we have them portrayed here as forest habitat associations, hardwood, mixedwood, softwood, and oak pine to show most likely where you're going to see the different bird species in the different forest habitat associations. And then we indicate which different forest types uh, fall under each different association. And for what I perceive as the meat of some of these guides is the stand level considerations and the silvicultural systems for Michigan. Well, not just Michigan, but this is relevant for the whole region. But we have information just about in my eyes, it's simple, simple details about stand level considerations. So vertical structure, gaps, uh, large diameter trees, standing dead trees, dead woody debris and leaf litter on the ground. Sometimes, like I said, I think these are simple aspects, but they are the details that birds utilize in their habitat and how we can better help create these habitat features for birds. And then we end off the information in Michigan with specifics about different silvicultural systems and how you can think about bird habitat as you are planning that silvicultural practices on the forest. And then after that, we do have a little bit of shortened, or I don't want to say shortened, but maybe cheat sheets about finding information very quickly. It might be a little hard to see on this slide, but in the guide we have our priority species laid out in a graph form to show what habitat for forest habitat associations you're going to likely find them in, how old the forest types are, the different management recommendations we have for the species, and then several other aspects, just all in 1 or 2 pages here to find information quickly. And then for anybody that is looking for something to be able to take notes and data on the forests that they are working in while they're out in the woods. We do have habitat assessment data sheets that you can pull from the guide, and this is helpful in being able to look at those stand level characteristics for taking notes. So again, the vertical structure, species diversity, large diameter trees, dead standing trees. Taking notes on what is available out in the woods is important. And we do have a version of this habitat data sheet. This one here is specifically from the manager's guide, but we do have a one-page data sheet that landowners can also utilize. It's a little bit slimmed down to uh, so they can, it's a little bit easier to take notes for. And if you're not able to get your hands on a physical copy of our guide and you want to take a look at everything, you can find it all on michiganaudubon.org under their Our Conservation Impact. And then we have a spot for forestry for Michigan birds. So we do have a couple links that you can find PDFs for, um, specifically, of course, for these guides, but we also have links for just those habitat data sheets. So you're not having to pull them directly out of the guide if you want to print some off to be able to take out into the woods. And if there are other questions and things you need from the Michigan resources, I'm always happy to chat and always happy to try and help out where I can. But that is everything that I've got for you today. So I'm going to pass it off to Christian to talk about Minnesota.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to share my screen now. Do we have a slide?
Yes, looks good.
Great. Okay, I'm going to talk from now until about 10:40 Central Time, and then Jamie's going to come in and talk a little bit about Wisconsin and maybe some other things for the last 10 or for about 10 more minutes till about 10:2, and then we'll have some Q&A if you're interested. And I was just looking at the number of participants right now, and it looks like we have almost 18 people on right now. So everyone is going to get their own bird to take home from our 18 birds in Minnesota as a soup. No, I'm just kidding. So I'll get into it. So my name is Christian Nelson. I'm the Lake States coordinator with the Forest Stewards Guild and also the primary author of the new guidebook that I'll be showing today. I thought I'd start out with just a little bit about the Forest Stewards Guild, in case you're not aware. The Forest Stewards Guild is a national nonprofit forest advocacy group with roughly 35 employees and 700 members in the organization, kind of scattered across the U.S. I'm in northern Minnesota near Duluth, and another one of my colleagues is down in Mankato. We've got people in Madison, Wisconsin, East Coast, the South, the West, and our headquarters is in Santa Fe, New Mexico. But ecological forestry, policy, we've got people going to Washington, D.C., things like that. So it's a big organization with their hands in a lot of things, prescribed fire policy, things like that. So today I'm going to talk. So I actually have about an hour long presentation here, but I don't have an hour to present. So I'm going to skip over things that Michael has covered or that we just don't have time for. But roughly, I'm going to try to cover bird populations, what the Minnesota Forestry for the Birds program is about, a little bit about the project history and who's behind all of it, a look inside the book, and the forest habitat types that we chose for Minnesota. If you're a landowner or a forester or a wildlife biologist, you might be interested in that, as well as the focal birds that we have chosen. And we probably won't have time to do a sample assessment, but we'll see how it works out. So Michael already covered this, so I'm going to kind of skip over this, but we all know that birds have been declining since the 70s. And Minnesota has very high bird species richness. In fact, as Michael's previous slide showed, the whole kind of northern portion, northern, central, and northeastern portion of the U.S. has especially high bird species richness. In other words, the number of species that are here relative to other forests in the U.S. The only thing that's sort of misleading about this is forest species richness. And so if it looks like the Dakotas are doing very poorly, it's not because they have such poor forest management, because they just don't have forests. And so I think down here in the South and the Appalachians and things like that is really instructive, because heavily forested, but they simply do not have the same kind of bird species richness that we have, sort of straddling between the boreal forest and forest to the south. And so we're kind of in that unique niche in the US, I think. And then Minnesota itself is kind of unique in that we have 3 different ecological provinces that are forested in the state. So if you can see my laser pointer here, this is all forested basically. This is prairie and actually largely agriculture now. And we have about 18 million acres of forests. So between the fact that we know birds are hurting, Minnesota has diverse forests, lots of forests, and that the whole region is pretty diverse in birds, we have a very good opportunity to do things for the birds here. And so the overall program goals that we have for Minnesota Forestry for the Birds are very similar to Michigan and other states' goals, in that basically our ultimate goal is to provide guidance, management recommendations, and awareness and education opportunities, ultimately to try to bring good forest management and land management practices onto the ground to enhance bird habitat, especially breeding bird habitat in the state, forest breeding bird habitat, to provide silvicultural recommendations to do that, to sort of connect the idea between having working woodlands, active forest management, and still having quality bird habitat. In fact, the two are very complementary. To collaborate and support basically foresters, bring them together with landowners and wildlife managers and things like that, to host webinars and educational opportunities like this, to spread the word not only to professionals, but also to landowners and things like that. Again, the ultimate goal is to make meaningful changes on the ground. The program, I'm going to kind of glance over this pretty quickly too, but the program, like Michigan, was something that was in the development phase for quite some time. In 2008, roughly, Vermont was one of the first states to do something like this, to develop forest management guidelines specifically for bird habitat. Several states followed. It came onto the radar. It's probably been on people's radar for a long time in the state, but people started taking a very serious look at it. One of the people I saw as a participant today is Peter Deezer with the American Bird Conservancy, was early into this process of envisioning a program, trying to get it something started in Minnesota. Michael Lynch, who's with the Forest Stewards Guild, was another key player. Alexis Grindy with the University of Minnesota's Natural Resource Research Institute, another key player. Starting in about 2018, people started talking, funding was pursued, It wasn't successful. It's a very competitive environment to get some of these funds. But finally, in roughly 2023, I think funding was procured, or late 2022, something like that. I'll talk about where that funding came from. Um, but I just wanted to basically say it's a lot of people have been doing a lot of work before anything really got off the ground to sort of everything into place. And then to actually sort of get everything across the finish line has been another process. Um, our audience for this whole project is aimed at both professional forest managers and land managers, but also forest land owners. So this could be people that don't know much about forestry necessarily, but they own 20 acres, 40 acres, 100 acres of wood somewhere. And therefore they have important habitat, whether they know it or not. So part of the education is to let people know what they have and let them know that there's options, that they can meet multiple objectives at the same time. Maybe their primary interest is revenue, maybe it's deer hunting habitat, but there are ways to get those things in place while also doing things that will enhance the habitat overall for the success of breeding birds. So Michael said this isn't the first guide, and it's true. There's been many before us. Michigan served as a very important template for us. We really liked what they did, and it's not surprising they're our neighboring state. They have a lot of overlap with us. So we really took a lot of what we liked from what Michigan had done and sort of made it our own, and then sort of added or tweaked things to suit Minnesota and our overall objectives. So I just wanted to also shout out to our funding source because none of this would have happened without any money. And just briefly, the sort of chain of funding was the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which is ultimately funded from the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. That money sort of got subawarded to what is called the Upper Mississippi Great Lakes Joint Venture. There's a few participants on the call today from that entity. And then that money was awarded to the American Bird Conservancy, which then kind of split it off. And some of that went to the Forest Stewards Guild to hire me to sort of coordinate this whole process and be the lead author. And other money went to Jayme Strange, our host today, with the Northern Forest Conservation Delivery Network, and ABC. She was hired as a coordinator to sort of get all the different regional players talking and coordinating and sort of get the word out, and also just sort of start spearheading a similar initiative in Wisconsin that Jayme will probably talk more about during her time. Took a lot of people, and I want to bring this up not only to say thanks and to give recognition and credit where it's due, but for those that are wondering, the amount of expertise that we were able to get around this table was really impressive. Another shout out to Peter Deezer on the call right now because he was so instrumental in getting, before there was ever funding, before I was hired, really spent a lot of time trying to get all the key players that he could think of and around the state, people with wildlife expertise, with specifically bird and avian ecology expertise, forestry expertise, sort of different representatives in county forestry or the Ruffed Grouse Society. We had experts from NRI who are very well versed in northern Minnesota's birds, and then we wanted some people that maybe spend a little bit more time in the southern region of our state, the forested area. So that would be the Audubon Upper Mississippi River group. And so we had technical assistance from the University of Minnesota's NRI program, and Bellamy. I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name right, but she did incredible editing work for us. And also a graphic designer I wanted to shout out because she made what I gave her, which wasn't that pretty, and turned it into something that was very, very efficient and pretty and overall very nice. So inside, this is the part a lot of you are probably wanting to know. Hopefully you can see this. I'm going to try to use this little magnifying tool. Hopefully that works. But here's what's inside. All the talks previous to today, I have not been able to fully show what's inside, so I'm pretty excited to have a finished product now and actually say like, hey, here's not what we're thinking about. Here's what we actually did. So we've got some baseline information about why is forestry important in Minnesota and sort of the unique opportunities we have and some of the unique threats to birds in the area. A little bit about Minnesota's basically biogeography, forest ecology, how forests work, how they're distributed across the state. I think that stuff's really fascinating, really interesting for people that aren't experienced or that knowledgeable about it. I think it really helps tie things together and sort of show a holistic perspective on forests. Um, Forest habitat types, the birds that we actually focused on, which we'll get to um, a little bit about why manage forests, why would we want to take an active role and not necessarily just let nature take its course, for example, or nature do its thing. We recommend silvicultural treatments, um, including ones for each of our unique forest types we identified across the state. Some big picture stuff, that's the landscape level considerations. And then not to be at all dismissed because it's almost half the content, but our the appendices in this guidebook are very rich with a lot of content, and I'm pretty excited about actually what ended up in those. A lot of ecology and habitat information. We wanted to make sure that the terminology we're using was well defined so that if you're not a professional, you could still tell what we're talking about. But if you are a professional, you'll recognize some of the words and realize that there's some real science and some meat behind recommendations and the thought process behind it. And then ultimately a worksheet to sort of help you as either a forester or a private landowner assess your own working woodlands. It looks like I have about 5 minutes or so. So keep plugging at it. So one of the first things we had to do was determine what forest types we were going to use. And I'm not going to spend as much time as I might on this slide for the interest of time, but here's what we ended up with. And I guess the take home that I wanted to mention is that birds, this was new to me. This is not something that I would have anticipated, but birds are largely blind to species. Not all birds, but many birds are blind to species, and they are more, they see a forest more for the structure. So the size of the trees, the age of the trees, the distribution of the trees, whether or not there's gaps in a forest, or whether it's pretty solid and contiguous, whether or not you have sort of one layer of forest or multiple layers with tall trees and intermediate trees and a rich developed shrub layer. But birds basically see these things not necessarily as species, but as just sort of their structural features. But foresters and forest managers and some other creatures see these forests very differently, and the way that they work and function ecologically are very different. And the way you would manage them as a forester or wildlife manager are also different. So we had to try to figure out how can we define all the forest habitat types in Minnesota in a way that is meaningful to birds and is in a way that is pragmatic and logistically practical for foresters that are actually going to try to do something with that information. So we broadly divided the forest in Minnesota across all 18 million acres of the forest land into four broad categories. Lowland conifers, these are like spruce bogs, cedar swamps, tamarack swamps, things like that. Lowland hardwoods, these are low, wet areas of deciduous trees. We've got black ash, and then bottomland types that tend to go along rivers and things like that. We've got upland deciduous and mixed conifer stands. Probably the bulk of central and northern Minnesota falls into this category. And we've got subtypes here. We've got aspen and birch, oaks, northern hardwoods, which are like sugar maple stands and things like that. And lastly, we have upland conifers, which are things like jack pine, red pine, white pine, things like that. We had 250 bird species that breed in Minnesota. 150 of them breed in the forests of Minnesota, and we didn't want to develop a guidebook that was 5,000 pages. So we wanted to pare that down into roughly, well, we ended up with 18 birds. So we tried to find birds that you can identify that have a distinct conservation need. Maybe they're struggling in some way, that sort of are not generalists and kind of exist everywhere, but that are pretty unique to these specific forest habitat types. Again, common enough that you stand a chance of seeing them, and you can kind of know that you have them or do management and find them sort of taking up residence in your newly managed forest. And so we ended up with these 18 birds, divided up into the four different major forest cover types. I've underlined in red the birds that are of species of greatest conservation needs. So these are birds that are particularly struggling. And you can see we have quite a few. Not all of them are necessarily struggling, but many of them are, almost half. This is the type of information that you'll find about each of our birds. It's a similar format as Michigan, with some background information about sort of generally what they look like, where they spend their winters, whether that's right here in your backyard all year, or they may be either flying down to Central South America or something like that. A little bit about their sort of their population status. That's this. Oh, I've got this laser pointer. Whether or not their range is, if they're increasing sort of across their whole distribution, how they're doing specifically in Minnesota, how the partners in flight entity ranks their sort of vulnerability and population stability, whether or not Minnesota DNR, if it's on their radar as a species that is sort of particular concern, and if climate change is expected to sort of have a particularly harsh and deleterious effect on them. Um, we have information about each of our forest habitat types, including other trees that you might find in those, some features about them, some ecological information about them, sort of how they develop, how they're maintained. All stuff that I'm a forester, but I'm a forest ecologist really at heart. I really love tying everything together. Wildlife information, the general trend of the forest, and then also how that trend might be impacted in the future with climate change, some other species, both birds and non-bird wildlife that might exist in that same stand. So oftentimes the things that we're recommending, in fact, most of the time, the things that we're recommending for a given habitat or a given bird are probably going to benefit all of the other creatures that exist in that same forest. So maybe you're not a big fan of birds, but you like salamanders or other trees, or you want to see a fisher or something like that, a wood turtle. This book will give you the guidance to make quality habitat for those creatures as well. I think I'm running out of time, but
You're fine. Keep going, Christian.
okay, thank you. So, like Michigan, in fact, we got this from Michigan, but we also have identified these as very important structural components of any given forest stand. And I think the take home message for our entire book is if you can attend to these features in your forest, and we'll give you the guidance to show you different ways to do that in different forest types. But ultimately, if you can address some of these things and enhance these features, you will be enhancing features for the birds and all the other wildlife. Um, and essentially, what we're trying to do with all of our recommendations is what I don't call, a lot of people call it ecological forestry, which is basically trying to replicate natural processes with our forest management techniques. So, for example, if a given forest type is generally maintained by wildfire, how can we, without lighting the woods on fire, how can we do that and sort of get some of the same features that a wildfire would deliver? So, example, a wildfire might not burn everything up. It might burn some areas a lot, some areas less. It might kill a patch of overstory trees in one area. It might largely skip another area. And ultimately, in a forest that is maintained by fire, what you'll end up with is usually a mosaic of old trees, young trees, park-like openings, very dense closed openings, a whole shift of species away from, or a shift of away from species that do not like fire towards species that like fire, and that would normally be found in those types of habitats, things like that. We also have information about just sort of how you would go about managing forests and sort of the the general process that most foresters, consulting foresters, or foresters and land managers in general will sort of think about how to manage a forest. So, first of all, what do you what do you want from your forest? What do you have? And then based on what you want and what you have, is there a way to get there? What's the best way to get there? Do you have to modify some of your goals and objectives based on what you have and what's possible there? Make a plan, implement that plan, and then see if your plan worked. And if your plan worked well, then maybe you go into some sort of maintenance phase. And if it didn't work well, then maybe you try to do something else to enhance the get more white pine here if that was your goal, or get more standing dead wood over here if that was your goal. So just a whole sort of process that you go through in thinking about managing your forests. We're not going to have time, unfortunately, to do this, but what you are looking at here is a habitat assessment worksheet. It's similar to the one that Michael was just showing for Michigan. Um, we tweaked it a little bit, but ultimately, what this whole worksheet process will do was will give you sort of a way to quantify and kind of systematically go through your woods, whether you're a landowner without a lot of forestry knowledge to begin with, or you're a professional forester with a lot of knowledge. This will sort of walk you through and get you to think about largely those 10 ecological elements. So after you go through a stand, you can sort of look at your sheet, your data sheet, and say, what do we have? What's possible? What birds are here? What are some problem areas? And then you can start thinking about what you might do to fix it. There's information you can then look up about each of the birds that maybe you encountered within your woods, and how you might manage to get more of that specific species. You might have multiple different species that are covered in our guidebook in your woods, and you can sort of compare and contrast strategies that will enhance the habitat for any and all of them. And then the take home message, as I sort of wrap things up here, is basically just the idea that our whole program is more than just this guidebook. It is this guidebook plus webinars, plus outreach, plus getting into people's office buildings and group meetings and things like that, and spreading the word. Again, at the end of the day, what we're hoping to do here is to change how forestry is done, in a way that will ultimately be beneficial for forest birds in Minnesota. Oh, and I just wanted to mention another quick look inside. I mentioned that our appendices are well worth visiting. They're not just sort of relegated extra info. It's great info. And here's a screenshot example of one and a half of the three or so pages of additional resources we have. Anything from I want to know more about birds, I want to know more about forests, more about climate change. I'm a landowner. I want to know what I can do to sort of help offset some of the costs that I might experience or get tax incentives. How do I even find a forester? Give you some more ecology information, some books to read, some websites to visit, things like that. And so the appendices are really loaded up with all kinds of resources that are applicable and relevant to people in Minnesota. So if you want more information about our program, there is a PDF, free, 56 pages, very nice if I do say so myself. That is our guidebook. That is available at that first link. There are hard copies that I know you can't really see this very well, but I'm holding up a spiral bound hard copy. It turned out very nice. It's a really nice book. We're giving these away at some of our workshops and things like that, and pursuing funding to sort of produce more of these and get the hard copies to more people's hands. That QR code will also go straight to the Forest Stewards Guild website where things are hosted. And that's it. I think I'm out of time. I'll kick it off to Jayme. She'll talk for a few minutes and then we'll open it up to questions.
Thank you,
Sound good?
Christian. Yeah, thank you. so exciting to see Minnesota get published, and we're really excited to get it to in everyone's hands. So please contact Christian or I or anyone from ABC and Foresters Guild if you want a fresh copy. Let me share my screen.
It was a big project. It took over 2 years all told, I think, really. And
Just the writing of it, right? That's just the writing.
yeah, the
So,
writing was, yeah, at least a year.
mhm.
And so, yeah, really happy that it all came together and that I had this opportunity today. Okay, I'll be quiet now.
No worries. No, there's no structure to our webinars, and I re really don't want to talk too much today. I just really wanted to kind of sh highlight some things about, the Michigan program and the Minnesota program are science-based part of the silviculture. So we're bringing that science of the bird species and the silvicultural treatments and best management practices for the forest that are related to all of our like high level like joint venture habitat plans and like partners in flight is a good example. And we've got like the North American Migratory Bird Act and all these things that are like high level coming down the chain to relate it to each state. And so I get a lot of questions like, why do you just have it by each state? And obviously, like each state functions a little differently with forest management, and there are little small differences in the habitat types that are in these three states. And I think an ultimate goal would to be have like a Great Lakes initiative where we can get these initiatives talking across state lines because the birds, like Christian was saying, they don't really know the species, they don't know the state lines either. So, it's just a really great way for our joint venture to step down those habitat management plans with that science-based those techniques from like NRI or Fish and Wildlife or Michigan Audubon, just coming down the pike to put conservation on the ground with our landowners and our natural resource managers. So, anyways, I am going to share just a little bit about Wisconsin because I know I get a lot of those questions too. Wisconsin is in motion. We have a working group together. Um, Let me get my slide going here. So the Wisconsin DNR began this. I think it was like Brad Hucknick, Sarah Herrick, Greg Edge, a few of those like big players here in our state of Wisconsin uh, created a white paper, and they were like, "How can we get this in Wisconsin?" And they, have a lot of duties. They wear a lot of hats. These initiatives are really volunteer based at the beginning. So great shout out to Peter Deezer in Minnesota because he kept it going during, and Peg Robertson. I know she's on the call today too. Just keeping that discussion going with our partners to actually get to that finish line of having a guidebook. So Wisconsin. We have a white paper and we have a core group, and our objectives are the same thing as Michigan and Minnesota, just improving habitat for regionally appropriate forest birds in our state. And I highlighted or bolded here, identify opportunities regionally. So our important bird areas, conservation opportunity areas, ecological landscapes. So we've been focusing a lot on like, and we may be taking a different trajectory, but we've been looking at areas that already have really great demonstration sites for birds. And we've been talking about different partners that we could bring to the table to highlight the great work that they're doing for forest birds. So we've already started doing that within our state. And then the goal of engaging our woodland owners and forest stewardships, working with providing foresters with these tools to meet customers with their forest management objectives, working alongside with forest management goals within the state of Wisconsin. So same goals. We've had three virtual gatherings to just kind of talk about what it could look like for Wisconsin and who do we want at the table to help with this. And it's been really fruitful, and I've just really enjoyed working with some of the partners that we work outside of Forestry for Birds. And getting those that information already out and compiled uh, for this initiative. So our current partners are listed here, but we'd love to add more. Even if you're in within these partners, we like I was saying with the science-based information from like NRI in Duluth, we have Wisconsin UW Stevens Point in Wisconsin. So they have forest management program that recently is with Amelia Scogan, a grad student, it has compiled different bird data that is on certain forest techniques. And so we're hoping to use her thesis as kind of like a steward to getting these guidebooks. And because a lot of that is focused on like forest management for birds. And it's giving us that science-based information of like what birds are responding to this management and how is it benefiting them. So that's one way we also have UW Extension on our side just to help out with this program. But lots of counties and Wisconsin Society of Ornithology to get down to the landowners, the private landowners and such, or the people who are interested in going out and birding. And so I kind of threw together a quick map of so like I said, we've been talking about different sites. We've proposed a few grants. Obviously, the grant programs are a little in limbo right now, but we've been working together to try to like combine resources to how do we do this? And is there a possibility we can get some funds to like lead some writing and get a guidebook printed with our fabulous graphic designer? We will probably still use Lana, who did Minnesota and Michigan, because we just love like she knows the region, she's from the region, and she also just does a really fabulous job of like, you know, making a simplified graphic of where the birds like to habituate. So here's our map of like demonstration sites that are across all of our partners that I shared in the last slide. I also have a QR code if you want to fill out the form. I know we have a small audience here today, but we do have quite a few people that are watching the recording. So please feel free to join our initiative. I'll also post the link here in the chat if you're not using QR codes. Let's see if I can do that. There we go. Sorry, that might be twice. Anyways, yeah, so if you want to join the Wisconsin initiative, please let me know. If you're not from Wisconsin, we are still, Michael and I talk about this a lot about having a Great Lakes initiative to just look at the whole landscape of like for my region in Northern Forest, BCR 12, but in general, looking at forested landscapes in the Great Lakes region to collaborate across state lines would be something really valuable and having all of these natural resource managers talk across state lines really brings some creative new techniques. And it's just a great way to brainstorm. I'm not sure if I have any more slides here. Oh, this is just if you're not part of the Northern Forest Bird Network, feel free to send me an email or you can join our mailing list and keep track of all the things going on in the region. With that, please let me know. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts or shout outs? I know we have a small crowd here today, but quite a few of you have been part of this process for all three states. So thank you so much, Michael and Christian, for giving us an overview of your states. It's been really fun working with both of you and collaborating on, different ideas and, I know we're all in different phases too of these initiatives, so that's been really interesting to take advice from Michael throughout this whole process. So, any thoughts or questions from the audience?
No, it's great information. Um, any more thoughts about how you'll get this out to landowners?
For Minnesota?
Yeah. Or yeah, Minnesota would be a
Um,
good question.
yeah, we're doing a series of webinars. Jayme, was that last week that you did Fridays or two
It's two
Fridays
weeks
ago?
ago.
Two
Yeah,
2 weeks ago
that's one.
already. Did Fridays with a Forester, which is something I did as a preview about a year ago, something like that. So that's one way of getting the word out. This time, I think, yeah, we had a link, right? Yeah, we were able to share,
Mhm.
actually it wasn't a preview anymore. It was actually getting the word out. And then we've got other webinars coming up. A lot of people are getting invited to speak at different conferences of all sorts. Peter, I see you're unmuting, so you are probably planning to chime in here too. So I'll just step aside for a second.
No, well, I'm not sure you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. I saw my video wasn't working. I'm in sort of an odd place right now, but um, just to mention the Forestry for Minnesota Birds Working Group is a living, breathing group of collaborative bodies, county, state, federal, tribal, NGO research. So working with folks like the Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative with the University of Minnesota and Minnesota Extension, the Minnesota DNR, NGOs like yourselves, the Upper Mississippi Great Lakes Joint Venture, American Bird Conservancy. We're all kind of working together on a collaborative effort to get the guide out as far and wide as possible. And while you're here, Peg, tip of the cap to you, because we wouldn't be where we are today without you getting that group together again and trying again to push this initiative in Minnesota.
Mhm.
So I just wanted to say thank you for that. And we're in an
Thanks, Jay.
exciting time. There's a ton of energy. Where we have our guides now hot off the press, and so now we're working on a couple, some outreach events. But I think there's an upcoming event that the guild is hosting
Mhm.
in June, the Northern Forest Bird Network in October, and I'm sure a number of other workshops and webinars in between. So a lot of fun stuff.
Yeah, and I think we've got something like 1,000 hard copy books
Oops,
published.
can't hear you, Christian.
Oh,
I can
Can
hear you
everyone else?
fine.
Oh,
I can hear
apparently
I
Christian.
I
can I
can't
can
hear
hear you.
anyone else. I'll mute myself. Everyone take care.
Thanks, Peter.
yeah, thanks. So I was just gonna say we have got about 1,000 hard copies, roughly, something like that. And
Mhm.
the Sustainable Forest Education Co-op has got a bunch that they're going to distribute. NRI picked up a bunch of copies yesterday, and the U.S. Forest Service and another group. So we've got people down in Mankato, boxes. Jayme, you received quite a few boxes. And so the idea basically is as we host events and relevant events to try to hand these off. Funding is, of course, always a problem. If we had a gazillion dollars, we could print a gazillion books. And one of our big problems to get them into people's hands is shipping costs.
Mhm.
We can get the books, but then how do we get books to people? If they come to events, that's easy. But if someone's sitting at their house or sitting attending a webinar like this and they want a copy,
Mhm.
fortunately we have the PDF and it's the exact same content. And that's free and very easily distributable. But yeah, so I think I see Michael, you unmuted as well, but I know Michael, you have been the whole Michigan program's been you get funding, you print books, you give them away, you're out of books, try to get more funding, you get it, you get more books. So we're going to play that game for a long time too.
Yes, it is a little bit print a little bit here, print more, print more. So far we have printed 4,200 different copies of our two guides. 2,900 of the landowners and uh, 12 or 1,300 managers guides. So yes, the funding for printing is definitely the hard part. Um, I haven't had to actually ship out too many of these guides, or actually for shipping costs. We have been able to utilize a lot of different partners and conferences and presentations and uh, being able to physically hand off these guides to other partners. So that's helped us a lot.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's the next phase for Minnesota is to have those workshops and events. We're going to be at SFI here in a couple of weeks, and I don't think we'll be handing them out left and right, but because it's an international conference. But if anybody from Minnesota comes by our booth, our ABC booth, I will give them a copy. But yeah, any other questions or thoughts? Okay, well, we are at the top of the hour, so I'll let everybody go back to their day. But thank you so much for joining the Northern Forest Bird Network webinar this week. And I just hope you all have a really great spring. And thank you, Christian and Michael, for your presentations today. I appreciate it.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Yes,
Thanks, Jayme.
yes. Have a good
And thanks
day.
y'all for attending.
Bye, everybody.